In the history of eastern hardwoods, fire has pretty much been eradicated from the landscape, and for lots of good reasons, you know, protecting homes, protecting timber from damage from destructive wildfires. But in the course of fire protection for many years now, shortleaf pine has pretty much disappeared as far as reproducing itself, which means that when we find a shortleaf pine, which we do still have some on the forest, they're typically around 100 years old, and we just don't have any younger than that unless they've been planted, or in a few rare cases, if there was a fire, accidental fire in a certain area, there might be just a couple of them that managed to come up. But so we're interested in restoring that species on the landscape here on the Berea College forest, and prescribed burning is one of the ways that we can do that. I was reading the management plan by Silas Mason, our first forester. He wrote it around 1910, and it's one of the earliest forest management plans in the U.S. He was a real leader in conservation and forestry, and he wrote this management plan, and one of the things that he mentioned about the Berea College forest was that the ridges, especially the main two ridges, of which this area that we're talking about restoring pine on, that those ridges were primarily composed of shortleaf pine and American chestnut. So there's historical importance. I feel like if we can restore some things that were historically here pre-settlement or right after settlement, which would have been the case here before the species composition was impacted by European style settlement, then that'd be a good thing for us to try to do. So unfortunately, the American chestnut pretty much was exterminated everywhere from an invasive disease, the chestnut blight, but they still persist in stumps and root systems. In that particular area, I felt like it was the best suited to restore the species, the shortleaf pine, because there is still a small component that persists there. And there's also an area where there's much more presence of American chestnut sprouts than I've seen anywhere else on the forest. So I picked the particular area for those reasons, and we had to do a preliminary harvest, a thinning harvest with some gaps that were created to make space, to make growing space and sunlight availability for those trees to be able to occupy this area in advance of the burn. The harvest was done about 2 years ago, and the burn we just did May 1st of this year. I talked about the historical importance, but you know, I believe that our ecosystems, our forest ecosystems, adapted in a way to where every species is important. It's there for a reason. It grew up there in association with other species, and they all interact together. And when you take one out, when you take American chestnut out, for instance, that was thought to be about a third of the trees in the southern Appalachians. So it was the heaviest mass-producing tree, hard mass-producing tree, which the chestnuts, you know, were super important for wildlife, for the settlers. They were important for hogs and, you know, human consumption. When that was taken out, then everything had to find something else to take its place, and oak acorns is the main thing. Shortleaf pine, it was one of the most sought after to cut down and use for construction whenever they were building the earliest houses in the area. They're very tall and straight, high quality southern pine type wood for construction. Pine oak forest has different characteristics than a strictly oak forest, and without shortleaf pine, the only pines left here that are native, that are of any number at all in significance, is Virginia pine. Forest structure is one of the components that's really being considered more now as having importance. For instance, by forest structure, I mean the different shapes, sizes, levels of the forest in terms of the structure of the trees and how they fit together. For instance, tall straight trees have a much greater distance from the ground to the canopy, so there's a very stretched understory below the canopy where birds, bats, different flying species can fly through the understory and it's open and they can feed on insects and things. Whereas if you have only the scrawny pine trees, or if you have a lot of mid-story shade-tolerant trees, which those would have not been nearly as abundant and persistent across the landscape with fire either, then you don't really have that large below canopy, sort of empty space between the trees anymore. So I think the verdict is still out, still being researched, still being discovered exactly why this tree or that tree or all the trees together are important. That's kind of an exciting thing to think about. Those were mid-story maples and beeches, black gum trees, the type of mid-story that I was just referring to, where fire, when it was on the landscape, it would periodically kind of, farmers and ranchers, would say clean out the woods, but as a forester, we think about it like we call it timber stand improvement, or you can call it mid-story removal. We're trying to sort of imitate what a fire would have done and historically did do across the forest landscape by thinning out and clearing out the small trees so that not as many of them become dense. It's not as dense in the understory, and also the species that would have survived fire and actually were fire adapted, like the oaks and pines, will have a chance to reproduce. Project I did in conjunction with a grant that was obtained through the Cumberland Plateau Initiative to restore shortleaf pine on the Cumberland Plateau, which were at the very north edge of it. We partnered with Berea College, or University of the South. Two of us have a lot in common as far as being small private colleges with large forest acreage, and we partnered up to compare strategies and to have a better chance to secure funding. But what we're going to do is probably buy shortleaf pine seedlings for planting in those openings, and we'll have to probably burn again, because I was just up there yesterday and the area that we burned has grown up, like head high already. It's incredible, because the root systems didn't die. It just burns the little seedlings and stuff to the ground, and then they sprout up. So it would be like it's a jungle out there to try to plant them. What we probably will try to do is do another burn, have the seedlings already ordered and everything in a cooler, and try to hurry up and plant them right away after the next burn in the spring. That's the short-term objective, to get about, I think there's about 16 acres of scattered openings across the 200-acre area that we burn about 155 acres of it. Some areas were too moist, and it just didn't burn. So within that area, there's about 16 acres that there's enough sunlight through the canopy, little patches, and those are the areas that we need to plant the pine. We're required to with the grant. So that'll get a quick establishment going on, but long term I would really like natural regeneration, because the pine that we're getting will probably have to come from Tennessee or Georgia, farther south, because there's really not much and not enough being produced by the state nursery here in Kentucky, and so the seed source will be farther south. But that's part of the strategy too, to have a Sewanee in particular. They're talking about climate change. Maybe a more southern seed source is a good thing, so they're actually planting some longleaf pine, which is their mountain longleaf pine, which is more of a southern species to them. So they're kind of pulling up some species from farther south to see, you know, just for an example, to see what happens. So we're kind of doing that too. Probably is we'll have to get a seed source farther south. But we do have some remnant shortleaf pine, and I really want to maintain that seed source too. I don't want them to die out, that local genetics to die out. So we've gained some experience with burning through the grant, but what I want to do then is do very small burns targeted just to like one little patch at a time. You know, I had talked about we got 16 acres, little patches. That's a lot to hurry up and do. But just going forward, as we harvest an area, as we produce a little gap targeted towards reproducing oak or reproducing shortleaf pine, depending on the location. If we have a shortleaf pine seed source around, then I want to do a little gap or 2 or 3 right around that few shortleaf pines, and then use fire just on a small scale. We'll do it ourselves. With this large fire, we had to have we had 12 people, I think, participate from the Division of Forestry, the Division of Wildlife, the Nature Conservancy, Forest Service. We had all these people helping us. We can't rely on that all the time. They really want to see this succeed, and to help us initiate a burn program. This is all new for us, but after we've done it another year, I think we'll have the experience. We'll get the training this fall. We're going to get Burn Boss certified training so we can legally do the burn on our own. There's regulations for that. So probably after this next year, after we've fulfilled the requirements of this grant, planted the pines and all that, then we'll begin to, what I'd like to do is begin to do targeted little patch gap cuts around where there's a seed source, so that we can get little groups, clusters of shortleaf pine. And the goal there is to create a mosaic pattern of structural complexity and species complexity. We don't have enough early succession forest, and you know, a lot of emphasis for wildlife and to continue, you know, so we don't have a sort of a collapse at some point where everything is the same age. We hear a lot about, you know, old growth, and I would like to see a lot of our forest is developing in old growth characteristics of, you know, we want it to become old growth, whatever definition you use, you know, lots of big trees, we like that. But we also need to have early succession forests, and what I call the cookie cutter forestry methods is to have a rotation. Decide, okay, at this age we're going to cut everything down and start over. Well, that gives you some early succession forest over several acres, you know, 20 acres or whatever, all at the same time. But in 5 to 10 years or so, it's not early succession anymore. Then it's saplings, and then it's a pole stand, and there's no early succession forest there for cover for ruffed grouse and for, you know, nesting and feeding for neotropical migrant birds. So that's doesn't have any early succession forest, that young even age stand, until it's harvested again in like for 80 years or something. So what I'm trying to do is manage a system where you have regular mix-ups of ages. You have a patchwork pattern where you have a forest that has mostly an intact mature canopy, but there's gaps here and there that sort of assimilate, copy off of natural processes like wind throw and fire concentrations and things that might have killed trees, the sort of things that naturally would occur in a forest. Forests are very dynamic. They're never just staying the same, and so people that really love, you know, mature old growth, you know, beautiful forests will think, well, we need to just preserve it. Let's preserve this. Let's not do anything. And I definitely support having forest preserves, that we don't harvest, you know, the mature trees. We leave them as long as they can survive. But one thing that you'll if you really look at what's going on in an old forest like that, is that you realize after you've been there for a few years and you've seen trees die and trees fall down and stuff, that you can't preserve it as it is. It's always changing, it's always dynamic. The trees are always competing with each other, and so the young trees, just like you said, the young trees, there'll be thousands of little seedlings per acre, and by the time they become mature, there might be 50. What happened to all the trees? If whether you cut them or not, they outcompete each other and die out and thin themselves out. So for a forester to be involved in that process, what we're able to do is introduce, human decision making into that natural thinning process and guide it. So maybe you have 30 different tree species all competing for sunlight, and you don't have very many, say you don't have very many shortleaf pine, you don't have very many butternut. Butternut's a tree that's in decline because of butternut canker. Those types of things, unaided by humans, might result in, maybe a red maple that's extremely common, maybe it's overtopping, out competing a tree that you only have, you got millions of red maples, but you only have 2 or 3 butternut trees. Well, you notice that red maple is getting overtopped. For a forester noticing things like that, and you notice it every day when you go in the forest, examples like that, then let's cut down this red maple, and then it will allow this tree has a gap to grow into. Those types of decisions is called the stand exclusion stage, or the development stage, where the different trees are sorting out which ones are going to survive, which ones are going to make it into the canopy, establish a successful dominance over their neighbors that are competing. So during that stage, that's when we do timber stand improvement, what we call crop tree release, for agriculture, agronomy type term, where you're thinking, this is the tree I want it to grow to maturity, it's my crop, so I'm going to release it to grow. That's a timber term, but that could be considered a crop for the wildlife too. It's going to be producing mast, it's going to be producing wildlife value. Or you could find on the other end of the spectrum, shagbark hickories are very desirable for bats to hang under the bark, and the bats are having trouble from white nose syndrome. Different bat species are kind of in peril, so we want to help them all we can. We want to leave those shagbark hickories. So that's another species. Maybe it really doesn't have a timber value, but it has a value in terms of we want to make those, ensure there's available for bats. Or a den tree. A den tree would be a tree that's had some kind of damage in the past that resulted in a limb being knocked off, or a wound, or a fire damage that's ended up hollow, and it's still alive. And maybe you want to get rid of some of the competition around it to ensure that it doesn't die, even though it's a hollow, tree of no economic value. We want to preserve that for the landscape, for species, wildlife that require dens. So we're kind of at the forefront of what's going on right now in forestry, and I think that's great. And we were able to build this forest outreach center. The timing couldn't be better, and it just seems like it works out. So it's a great time, right now, to be a forester here.